Hi there, welcome to Boxing Deep Dive. I'm Lyndon Hosking, and great to have you along for another episode of Classic Fights. This is where we go back in time to a big fight that's happened, well, I was going to say a long time ago, but it could be quite recently, but just some of the best fights in history. And there's a lot of ways to define the best fights in history, so we get a mix of everything. And we have a bit of fun and go back, as I said, just to revisit it and see what made that fight great. I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Mike Altamura. How are you, mate?
I'm glad to be back in the hot seat with you. It's been a while, so I'm
Has.
looking forward to actually talking about the bout that we're looking to present to all you guys. I hadn't watched it since my youth, so this is actually one of the original, probably the original 10 to 12 releases that came on the ESPN, Super Bouts and Super Fights.
That's right.
This is one of the under-the-radar ones, but, terrific fight. I actually hadn't gone back and watched it in its entirety in, like I said, probably about 15 years. So,
It's probably
yeah,
longer for
brought back
me.
a lot of memories.
I remember seeing it on those videos years and years ago, and I must admit I haven't watched it until I actually I had no choice but to watch it again because there's no actual highlight reel on YouTube. I had to download the whole thing and then cut it up myself. So apologies if the thing's not right, the edit, but I did the best I could. But a little bit of extra pressure on tonight, Mike, because we are live for the first time. I'm not gathering not many people are actually going to be out there watching because it's unannounced. I'm testing the whole live stream sort of thing. It's great to have you along, to be honest, with me. But I do this on a Monday night with Talking Boxing, and I really want to see how we go with having guests on. So you're our a guinea pig.
This is a beta test, as they say. Well, lucky it's not Tassie Brown. Otherwise, you'd need the censorship button every couple of
Well,
seconds.
yeah, I'm not sure I'd be game enough to go live if Tassie was on board. But look, you never know. Look, but at this stage, it's just us. We a little bit something different as well. We do get people on, and it looks like we have got one at the moment. There is a comment section there. If you've got a comment or question that you'd like to ask about the fight we're actually talking about, feel free to pop it in there. This is Andy there. Good on you, mate. Hello, fans. Lyndon, Mike, and chat. I think you're the only one in chat at the moment, mate, but we'll see how we go. Like and subscribe, which is awesome. So as I said, if you've got a question or comment, particularly to Mike here, he is the walking boxing encyclopedia. If he's got a question to ask, I guarantee he will be able to answer it. I'll pretend that I know, but he 100% knows.
I appreciate that. But yeah, I mean, if you're ready to get to the bout and ready to
Yes.
start delving into this, because I think that and what I will say is I'm glad that you couldn't find a highlight reel, because I would actually recommend everyone listening to this episode to go back and watch the bout in its entirety, because it's
It's a ripper.
one of those fights. It's not a fight that's pulsating throughout, like, say, Castillo and Diego Corrales, their first bout, but it's just high quality action for 15 straight rounds, nip and tuck battle, back and forth, a lot of momentum swings. It's everything that we love about the sweet science.
That's good, and thanks to Jai as well for Jai Marcus McAllister there. Love the show. That's great. I'm assuming it's this show, not the Talking Boxing show that I normally do. We get a lot of really good responses about this one. We've also got James Daly in there. So sorry I missed my favourite show last night. James, you should be sorry. We need your viewership. But no, good to have you along here anyway. And as I said, Mike, this is not normally put up a post to say we're going live, so we give everyone an opportunity. I've just thought tonight, hey, let's just give it a go and see how we go. So all you guys that are watching, there's a few of you that are watching at the moment. So if you've got a question or comment as we go, as we said, make sure you put it in there and we'll do our best to answer it. Now, Mike, we've been on here for, about 5 or 10 minutes and we haven't actually announced the fight we're doing. What do we got?
So we are going back early 80s. Eusebio Pedrosa, reigning WBA featherweight world champion and at the time lineal world champion, going up against Juan Laporte of Puerto Rico. This is actually, it's funny, like, there's trinkets in history that bring certain challenges. So, like, you go the early 2000s amongst the lighter weights, there was a whole series of fights with Thailand versus Mexico, Philippines versus Mexico. In the 70s and 80s, really starting with, of course, the great Roberto Duran of Panama and Esteban de Jesus of Puerto Rico, there was a bit of a Panama versus Puerto Rico rivalry. And this is another great chapter in that history, which it's only really in that pocket of time, in the 70s into like the early 80s. But basically, Panama, of course, on the back of Duran, really went through this kind of golden period of boxing in the 70s. And there was a number of champions. There was Alfonso Fraser. Of course, later there was Rafael Pedrosa, who is, of course, Eusebio Pedrosa's brother. And there was Eusebio Pedrosa, who essentially took over the reins at featherweight from the great Alexis Arguello. So when Alexis Arguello moved up in weight, the opportunity presented. Of course, Pedrosa won the world title, was a traveling champion, so fought all over the world, fought in Japan a number of times. Actually, this is a bit of history for you. Do you know who the only fighter ever to successfully defend the world title in Papua New Guinea is?
Papua New Guinea.
Eusebio Pedrosa.
Is that right? Who did he fight there?
Johnny Alba. Johnny Alba's really the only, I'm bringing up the date here, the 17th of the 11th, 1979. So Johnny Alba really is probably the only ever Papua New Guinean fighter that was ranked top 10 in the world amongst any weight class. And so, of course, the opportunity presented, and Pedrosa was a traveling champion. I mean, Pedrosa, though, really made his name knocking out a somewhat over-the-hill Ruben Olivares, the great Ruben Olivares, probably about 6-7 years really past his prime. And, you know, had a couple other really solid wins that kind of go under the radar.
I think Rocky Lockridge was in there.
Yeah, so I mean, 2 victories over Rocky Lockridge, and even like a 13th round knockout of Pat Ford. Pat Ford had just given Salvador Sanchez a terrific challenge. And Pedrosa was one of those guys that he got knocked out 3 times early career, but was never stopped again after that. So, you know, sometimes we talk about records all the time, and you can't always judge a book by its cover. Pedrosa got blasted out of there fighting for the WBA Bantamweight World title a few years earlier, moved up to featherweight and seemed a lot sturdier at featherweight. So then on the opposite side of the spectrum coming into this bout, so this is Pedrosa's about mid his world title championship reign, I should say. Laporte, still a young kid, 23 years of age when this fight takes place, but a few years earlier he'd given Salvador Sanchez a hell of a bout, a really, really tough bout. It was kind of a 10-round-to-5 kind of deal in Sanchez's favour.
I think, yeah.
And it was a coming of age, and then backed it up with, you know, we know how tough Rocky Lockridge is because, of course, he stopped the great Barry Michael of Australia. And Laporte is really the only guy to truly flatten him. He flattened him in 2 rounds, and that kind of made this fight exciting in the sense that Pedrosa was starting to look a little bit vulnerable in his recent title defenses, lapses in concentration. And, you know, this fight taking place Atlantic City, New Jersey, if anything, East Coast, slightly going to favour the Puerto Rican, you think. It's just a really, really good contrast of styles. Pedrosa, more fleet-footed, the better boxer, usually would accumulate and stop his opponents late if he was going to get him out of there. Laporte had a dynamic right hand, as we'll see from these highlights. So,
sorry, mate. I was just going to say, we'll start the highlights as you go in there. Keep talking.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just a beautifully matched contrast of styles, as you'll see. And, you know, I think that you'll see that there's definitely no nerves from this young man, Laporte, coming into this challenge. Even though he was 19-2 and only 23 years of age, he was quite seasoned by this stage of his career.
Yeah, so as we said at the start, January 24th, 1982, the Sands Casino Hotel in Atlantic City, New Jersey for the WBA featherweight title. I think you said Mike Pedrosa, 32-3. He'd made 13 defences of the title up until then, but he was still probably in the shadow of Salvador Sanchez, wasn't he? Because I think people thought, well, even though he's made those 13 defences, he's not the real deal until he beat Sanchez, who obviously held the WBC title.
Yeah, and even when Arguello had moved up and the titles were fragmented, Danny Little Red Lopez was considerably more popular. So when Sanchez stopped Lopez, Sanchez kind of took over the reins of the weight class. Of course, when Sanchez sadly passed away, then essentially the mantle of the lineal featherweight world championship would go to the winner of this contest.
So he'd won the title in 1978, the 13th round stoppage of Cecilio Lustra, and Lustra, I think that's how you pronounce it, 1978. He made, as you said, he made the defences against, or had fights against Ruben Olivares and Rocky Lockridge. Laporte, just for that one world title fight against Salvador Sanchez, of course, as you said, had lost in 1980. He did say it was 22 there, but I think you said with 23, and I'm going to believe you over the TV, I've got to say. So
no, it probably was 22. I just didn't probably fact check the month, so believe the TV over me.
But isn't it amazing as we see the fight? You can see Laporte start strong, really rocks Pedrosa early. It's hard to believe whether he was 22, 23, whatever it was, that this young kid, we see these days a lot of the fighters really don't start getting title shots to the 24, 25, even 26. At 22 or 23 years of age, having second world title fight goes to show how good this kid was at that age.
Yeah, it's just the calmness and the relaxation there. I think a lot of it's from how boxing's evolved. Amateur styles changed. Fighters generally turning pro a little later nowadays. Or if they do turn pro young, they're kind of steered a lot more cautiously, whereas back then it really wasn't quite the way as a rule. But, yeah, I mean, you can see that there's nothing really overwhelming Laporte, and a bit of what would be the trend of this fight as it evolves. You see that Pedrosa targeting the body and Laporte looking to, I would say, for lack of a better expression, chuck that overhand right hand, because that's what it is.
That was obviously the strategy, wasn't it? But one thing that I must admit watching this fight again, Mike, is that Pedrosa, I know he hasn't got the power, but he reminds me a lot of Alexis Arguello in that he is obviously tall for his weight, very calm, very calculated. He likes to set it up and then bang the right hand. I know he doesn't hit as hard as Arguello, but he just has that style where he wears you down, he grinds you down. He's by being patient, sticks to his plan, doesn't deviate, and just wears you down until he gets you out of there.
Very tall and very upright in his stance. You'd see that. So he's not always committed to his punches, but what it allowed, and you look at his upper body movement, see there, like just little pivot, little turn to absorb the punch, and then he's back ready to fire. He's not. We always talk about when you've got shorter fighters against taller foes, and we have this thought that the taller guy should be boxing from the outside and be on his toes and moving basically endlessly. Whereas you see here with Pedrosa, he's just kind of bopping in there, just trying to catch the shots, roll with them, and come back firing, because he actually punched quite short himself. And just you can see the target there, just keep getting close to that body and gradually grind down and break down Laporte to the body.
Now, there's obviously a lot of controversy after. We'll get to the scorecards after it finishes, of course, but there's controversy because of some of the tactics that Pedrosa used. Laporte and his team weren't happy. I think it was his trainer, Emil Griffith. Is that right, from memory?
Yeah, and also, like, just as a side note to that as well, there was multiple deductions for low shot.
Yeah.
2.
Yep.
And there was also multiple warnings to come thereafter. So there's the argument that potentially if you're going to deduct 2 points and continue to give warnings, there should have been a disqualification.
Well, you'd normally think that amount of warnings and points off would warrant that. So I think there was a lot of low blows. There's definitely some elbows in there, which you got warned countless times over. So I could probably see where Laporte and his team were coming from. But Pedrosa, I think his actual quote afterwards was, "We're professionals. Professionals don't cry."
Yeah, and the thing is as well, though, like with Pedrosa, if you look at his stance, especially kind of how his hands are a little bit elongated, and then against a shorter duck and foe, you can see why Laporte would be running into those elbows. I don't think that there's anything sinister about it. I think it's just kind of stylistically how their bodies match up.
Now, the fight itself, so Laporte obviously came out really, really quick, landed some good shots as he rocked Pedrosa early, but this was around the stage of the fight where Pedrosa started to up it. Well, it's probably past it now. Those middle rounds, Pedrosa really dominated. I think Laporte sort of come home a little bit in the couple of rounds before this, but this is when Pedrosa really started to kick it up a gear again.
Yeah, I mean, exceptional work rate and conditioning. That was always a trend. He had, like I said at the start, there was a sense of vulnerability because he had a habit of falling behind in fights or just scraping by in tight battles, looking a little vulnerable, maybe even somewhat gun-shy the first few rounds. And then once he kind of got cranked up, he just was, like a tornado rolling down a hill, so to speak. Just keep bring that pressure. But I think just the freshness of Laporte we're seeing here, he was able to kind of, suck it up and be able to return fire in a lot of these later rounds.
And of course, this was a 15-round fight. This was, I think it was this same year that was the last 15-round fight. Because obviously we had the Ray Mancini Duk Koo Kim fight, the tragedy in Las Vegas, which we might cover at some stage as well. So this obviously at the start of 1982. I think when was the Mancini Duk Koo Kim fight? Was that like mid-year?
Yeah, it was it mid-year or was it early? I'm sure it was
Yeah, it
early.
was. Well, I remember that the heat played a major factor. So you'd probably think in Vegas it would have been maybe June, July. I think I can
Yeah.
look that up. But as I said, after this fight, I think the Holmes Cooney fight was mid-year as well. That was a 15-round fight, of course. But I think after that Mancini Dooku Kim fight, I think that's his name, changed it forever and went back to 12-round fights from 1983 onwards.
I'll bring it up. So I'll bring the day
Yeah.
up. But
So this is about the
as we
stage two. Sorry, mate. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, like it's incredible the pace that they're
Yeah.
going.
Yeah, that's what I was
You
just
know
going
what
to
I'm
say
saying?
as well. It's hard to believe we're in the 13th or 14th round, whatever this is, and the pace of the fight, you can just see the way they're going at it there. Pedrosa just had that same pace throughout. Laporte had sort of the spikes in his work rate, but just for a 22, 23-year-old kid to be able to go 15 rounds at that pace, it's probably no wonder that he ended up winning a world title after this one.
Yeah, absolutely. No surprise there. And we won't spoil the result yet, but the fact that he was this tight with a guy who had made 13 defenses already just reflects the kind of caliber and quality that he had as a young fighter.
And
Just a real solid tradesman.
yeah, he was. Yeah, and you can see as the fight went on as well, he really switched the work to the body as well. He did do it early in the fight, but as the rounds went on, he really even went harder to the body. And of course, he had a few of those illegal tactics in there as well. I think you said that he probably should have had more points deducted. But you can see there the experience kicking in, pinning Laporte on the ropes, that work rate, pushing him back, and just digging into the body. Yeah, it was just a great effort from Pedrosa.
Yeah, I think as well, like some of those body shots, it's actually hard to shift Laporte's guard inside. Like Laporte had a real solid guard on the inside. It's hard to actually penetrate shots, especially short, squat body. Kevin Amell is nice, tight and tucked. You can see why a few shots are straying low inside.
And we've just got a comment there from James Daly. Well, before I was a boxing fan, only heard the name Laporte before. Great historical education, this. Yeah, mate, well, I'm glad. This is why we love doing these fights, James, because it really gives an opportunity for boxing fans, maybe they're new to the sport or a little bit younger or whatever it might be, just a real lesson in some of the great fights in history. And this is why we have Mike on the show, because he knows all of them. I think, was it a few weeks ago? What was the fight you had on? Was it Sandy Sadler and who was it?
We had Sadler and Pep, and we had Joe Lewis versus
That's right.
Billy Conn, the
Yeah.
first bout.
Great fight. So make sure, guys, you check this one out in full, because it's an awesome fight. This is the last round, and look at them go there. We'll obviously go over the scorecards in a second once the round ends here. We've got 10 seconds to go, and then a little bit what happened after this fight for both guys. So you can see there, I think we're about to finish up there, and that's the end of the fight. So Laporte actually thought he'd been robbed, because you can see there he's more than happy with himself that he got the decision. The official scores 144, 142, 145, 143, and 144, 141, all for Pedrosa. So it's interesting, Mike, I will say, we got the 2 points taken off. There was a lot of even rounds thrown in there.
Yeah, I thought Laporte edged the fight. I had it 8-7 Laporte, and I thought with the 2 point deductions, that swung at 3 points his favour. It actually, the interesting part is, there's two websites online that fans can go and score the bouts. One had an 88% disapproval rating, and the other one had an 86% disapproval rating.
For this decision.
For this decision. So you aggregate the two. 87% of fans believe Laporte was shafted. The New Jersey Commission actually, so Jersey Joe Walcott was the head of the New Jersey Commission, overturned the result, but they didn't have it within their powers. They couldn't supersede the sanctioning body to change the result, but they recommended it should be overturned, if that makes sense. So had this been a bout that was contested outside of a sanctioning body, the result would have been changed by the commission. That's how poor a decision it was. I've got a theory as to why it was carded that way. I think that we saw in a lot of those later round exchanges that Laporte was fighting almost exclusively with his back to the ropes. And I think that, it's easy just to say when you're watching on TV, oh, the judges should have seen this or they should have scored that or whatever. But when your back is to potentially two of the officials for entire rounds, maybe they're not catching the short shots that you're landing inside. Maybe they're only seeing that swarming work of Pedrosa, shots that are straying low, shots that Laporte's catching on the elbows, maybe they're not seeing them clean. So potentially that's why some of those closer rounds, amongst the later rounds, maybe they edged his way. That's my theory, anyways.
Yeah, look, watching the fight again, I probably had the other way 8-7 rounds for Pedrosa, but when you take the points off, it does swing it in Laporte's way. It amazes me, and I did read that Jersey Joe Walcott did overturn the decision, but it didn't obviously affect the belt changing hands. But do you think it was like that much a disparity? They're actually looking to overturn the result. I know lots of close fights go different ways, but I don't think it was that one-sided to Laporte that you could look at actually overturning it in favour of the challenger.
No, I think it's definitely a debatable decision, but it's in that territory between debatable to controversial. It's not James Toney versus David Tiberi, which is just an outrageous decision. You know what I'm saying? Like it's one that you just and you got to think as well at the time. You've got an aging champion in Pedrosa, and you've got a young upstart in Laporte, and probably those watching the crowd are more invested. Laporte really New York-based fighter, so the crowd's more invested on the East Coast in wanting to see Laporte come out victorious. Whereas Pedrosa, he doesn't speak English. He's Panamanian. He's been making his world title defenses all over the world. He doesn't really have a solid TV brand identity that's promotable compared to Laporte at the time.
Well, after this fight, of course, after all the controversy, and because I think Laporte actually put in a protest, all the controversy, whatever it was, Pedrosa, now he made 5 more defences, including there's a draw against Bernard Taylor, who was a very, very underrated fighter back in the day. That was in 82. Had the win over Rocky Lockridge in 83, and then lost his title to Barry McGuigan in 1985 and retired in 1992 after a 10-round loss to Mauro Gutierrez.
Yeah, well, he had 2 comebacks. He went 3-2 in his comebacks, but for all intents and purposes, he was retired after the Barry McGuigan bout. And of course, Boxing Hall of Famer. So, yeah, I don't think you can make 18 defenses of a world title and not be in the Hall of Fame. That's
exactly
how I perceive it.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, looking at this fight in particular, and seeing that he lost the title, was it 3 years later, Barry McGuigan? There's no way. I mean, I've got all due respect to Barry McGuigan, as I know you do, because you put him up against our man Jeff Fenech, but in the dream fights, that is. But the fact that Pedrosa lost to McGuigan probably showed that he was shocked, because with all due respect to McGuigan, I don't think he was in Pedrosa's league when he was at his peak.
And it's not just that he lost; it was a landslide decision. Like it was a near shutout by McGuigan. So that's a thing. Like, and it's with all great champions. Eventually, the thing is, when you hold the world title, which is a lot of people don't comprehend on the business side of sport, when you hold the world title, you get to a certain pay scale, and it's tough. If you know that you're slightly on the back nine, you just keep going until the wheels fall off. And Pedrosa, to his credit, his wheels, it was a slow burn. They were falling off from before this bout with Laporte, and he managed to hold on for, another, like you said, another 5 defenses before eventually it just said enough is enough. So, understandable, but that's why oftentimes when you see that passing of the torch and a guy loses at the end of his career, you can't really judge or gauge him on the guy that defeated him. It's like, even we look at, say, more recent generations, like, would you judge Arturo Gatti on losing to Alfonso Gomez at the end of his career?
Yeah.
And there's guys even prime that were the beat great fighters and still had world titles, and then they just lost it because you seen that they were dressed gradually, like Cotto. Cotto beats, Daniel Geale, all these guys, goes 12 rounds with Canelo, pushing the best in the world, wins another world title, and then loses to Saddam Ali. Like, all full credit to Saddam Ali, but that's someone nowhere near his level. It just eventually, when the wheels fall off, the wheels fall off.
Yeah, we'll get to Laporte in a minute. The other thing I was just going to say to you guys before I forget, if you've got some requests out there, it's good that there's a few of you guys out there watching live. I didn't really expect anyone, to be honest, because as I said, it was just put out there at the last minute. So if you've got some requests for some classic fights you'd like to see, let us know, because as I put the comment back up there, look backs like this, good education, but also keeps a memory of quality fights and fighters alive. And that's why we love it, Andy, because It gives us the chance to go back in time. We've all been following boxing all our lives and grew up. We call it the golden era of those 80s and 90s, I think it is, but of course we go back even further. But it's just good to revisit for ourselves. But also, I love some of your fights, Mike, because I hadn't seen a couple of them before, especially the Willie Pep and Sandy Sadler fights. I've seen highlights, but really good to go back and revisit those fights, because there's a lot of modern day fight fans that just don't know how good we had it back in the day.
Yeah, and how many times can you just go and revisit Hagler Hearns or the fights that there's like probably 20 go-to fights throughout history, but there's scores of others that have either been fight of the year contenders or just kind of lost and forgotten by history. So every now and then it's just great on this program or programs like this to shine the light on fights that people might not be familiar with. This might inspire our listeners to go and look up Pedrosa, to go and look up Juan Laporte and develop a greater appreciation for what they accomplished. Or for people that are big Kostya Tszyu fans, a lot of our listeners are Australian. Keep in mind, it was Kostya's fourth bout. He defeated, although it faded, he still defeated Juan Laporte, who was still tough as nails, who was still like a top 15 contender at that point. And that should make you go and appreciate how great Kostya was.
Well, I was just going to get to Laporte, but before we do, I don't want to pump you up too much here, Mike, but there's a comment in here you probably need to see. This is from Mezhar Hussain. Not sure whether you know him. Mike, best boxing brain in Australia. I've got to agree with that, Mike, because I think it's fact that you are. So I'm not sure whether you know Mezhar and you've put him up to this, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that agree.
Definitely haven't put him up to it, but I'm always humbled by all the support. To me, I have a chip on my shoulder because as I'm gradually aging, of course, I feel like everybody. I feel like a lot of the knowledge base or my capacity to absorb and hold on to knowledge is fading, and that's just a part of getting older and busier. And I want to feel like I was when I was younger, when you go back and you buy the latest fight magazine, or you find a magazine from 30 years earlier, or a book, and you absorb every single ounce and inch of the knowledge you intake, and you watch a fight, you absorb every part of what the commentary is projecting about the fight. And so, I love doing things like this because it just reminds me of how connected to history we need to be. And if I ever lose a sense of that, I want everybody to be vocal and just push me out of the fight game, because I don't deserve a spot in it. So it's great just to be able to sit here and reflect on things like this.
It is good, mate. And the thing is, I think we've spoken about it in the past on the show when Taji's been on about, back in the day, like these days you just switch on YouTube or whatever, and and there's fights all the time. Back in the day, we never had that luxury of having the big fights on TV. I mean, the massive fights probably would be on, but the everyday fights, we'd have to wait 3 months to get KO Magazine or World Boxing or The Ring or Boxing Monthly, whatever it was. There's so many different. I think I used to get 6 or 7 different magazines every month, but that's the way we educated ourselves. And I think it's a little bit different when you're reading about it rather than just watching it.
Yeah, because the visual you create for yourself is always grander than what it is in actuality. That's the thing. You can read about a bout and you just absorb it so differently. I remember there was a fight in Australia, Ricky Rayner versus Ronnie Reardon, and it was Australian Fight of the Year, maybe in I think it was 95, maybe it was. And the write-ups were incredible. And then, 10 years later, I finally secured a tape. I was like, oh, is that all it was? But it's because I built up this Apollo Creed versus Rocky Balboa type moment in my head of anticipation. But that's the beauty of when you're young and you're really building and breeding your fandom.
Yeah, I remember I used to get the magazines, and every single night in bed, there'd be a chapter or a section or a story that I'd read. I wouldn't just read the whole lot. I'd make it last the whole month. So if we got to the end of the month, the new ones would come and away I'd go again. But the thing is, all those great fighters of over the decades, even like the Hearns, Leonard, Haglers, Durant, I don't think I actually saw them fight until, like the mid to late 80s, I hadn't seen them fight because we just didn't get their fights over here.
Yeah, I mean, even
on pictures.
I first watched Laporte and Pedrosa, I would have watched this fight probably in like late 1991. And
So, yeah.
by that stage, I'd already was building my boxing collection, magazines, trading cards. I had a trading card of Juan Laporte, and his record, whatever his record was after 39 fights, it might have been 29-10. Something like that. I remember just gauging off the trading card and thinking, oh, he can't fight. He's got 10 losses.
Yeah.
And then you go back and actually watch the fight and you look at the historical context of who they're facing. The fact that the guy at 14, 15 bouts into his career was elite and never really stepped back from fighting elite competition till he retired, then you build an appreciation for that run rather than just being dismissive on the record.
Exactly. Well, speaking of Laporte and what he got up to after this, he did win the WBC featherweight title after this with a 10th round stoppage of Mario Miranda. Defended it twice. Lost the title to Wilfredo Gomez. I'll give you a chance to comment, mate. You can probably remember all this off your head, but I've had to write it down. So he lost to Wilfredo Gomez. He then had 5 different or separate attempts to win the world title after this, and lost the whole lot. He lost to, not 5, might have been 4. He lost to Barry McGuigan by 10-round decision. Lost the world title fight to Julio Cesar Chavez in 86. To John Molina by decision in 1989. Azuma Nelson by decision in 1990. Charles Murray in 1993, again decision. And in between that was the decision lost to Costa Tszyu in his 4th fight. So it's amazing that even though he's one of those fighters, isn't he, that he had a lot of losses on his record, but very, very deceptive, as you just said.
And he had that last world title shot was against Zach Padilla, the only stoppage loss of his career.
Oh, okay, I didn't see that one. Okay.
What was he, 40-16, and only had 1 stoppage throughout his career. But, yeah, he actually, and what I'll say as well is context matters. He gave Salvador Sanchez one of the hardest fights of his career, and he gave Prime Chavez one of his toughest challenges.
Yep.
That's all you need to know.
I missed that Padilla fight. Sorry. Yep, chuck that in there as well.
You can look at the record and say, oh, he had 5 more attempts. He didn't win another world title. Look at how he was challenging the toughest fighters of his generation. If he just wanted to pick back and wait and pick and choose his opponents for 5 years and build 15 wins, and then when the golden opportunity comes to win another world title, he would have won another world title. But he fought the absolute best in his generation. And this is, again, when I talk to people that are on the committee in Canastota that look at the ballots for the International Boxing Hall of Fame, this is what I get frustrated about when they don't understand historically, is because their votes count. They're the ones, essentially, that are going to look at who's on the ballot and opt whether to, grant them enough votes that they go in the Hall of Fame or not. You've got to understand historical context. To me, a guy like Laporte is greater than a world champion from France that only ever defended the title in France and was a world champion for 5 years in a 4-bout era and never fought any of the other top 2 or 3 fighters in the world. Laporte, for a long stretch, fought the absolute best there was. I mean, prime Chavez, prime Azuma Nelson, prime Salvador Sanchez. Wilfredo Gomez slightly on the back end of his career, but still, Pedrosa, mid-reign, knocked out, and when I say knocked out, completely drilled Rocky Lockridge. It's worth going to check that out.
Yep.
Future world champion. When you look at the context, the guy was an outstanding fighter.
Yeah, he was, and you're right. It should be based on overall career, not just what the record looks like. So he retired in 1999. He lost to another former world champion, Billy Costello, who was going to be all sorts of good things. He got obviously knocked out back in the day by Lonnie Smith, and then our mate Alexis Arguello came out of retirement and knocked him out again. And that was it for Billy Costello.
Yeah, and that fight between Laporte and Costello was just, what's that boxing movie with Robert De Niro? The one that he's like a grudge match.
Oh, a grudge match, yeah.
Which is like two old men battling it out for pride. That's all it was.
Yeah.
To me, it's like the last outing between Fenech and Azuma Nelson. Who cares? It shouldn't be on a professional record.
No, exactly, mate. Well, look, it was great to have you again on the show this week. Great to do it in a little bit of a different format. I hope you guys out there enjoyed it. Maybe we'll do it again. I'm not quite sure I'll trust Tassie on live TV, but anyway, we might see how we go.
I told you just need the mute button or the beep every time he speaks. So just do it in anticipation. Just soon as he starts to talk, just press it.
I have got the ability to mute him. Maybe I'll mute him and he can keep talking. He won't know that he's being muted. But anyway, no, we'll sort it out. But I hope it's, look, who knows, we might have a few rocky moments in the stream. I'm hoping that it came across okay. Because as I said, we want to start putting it in the Talking Boxing show on a Monday night. But mate, I think we've got back to Tassie next week, so I won't let everyone know exactly what we're doing yet. What we might actually do as well, if we want to go live at some stage too, Mike, is we might actually do our 5, I think we discussed our 5 favourite fights and our 5 favourite fighters of all time, and we'll go through and give everyone a bit of a chance to comment on that as well. So we might do that as a standalone episode as well.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, guys. Well, thanks very much for joining in. I hope you enjoyed it. And till next week, look out for classic fights. Thanks again. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, guys.